Hi there, my name is Dr. Kathryn Garforth from Garforth Education, and this is the Right to Read initiative. Today, I have the pleasure of being joined by Ms. Lynn Givens from Florida, and this is her third time on with us for this session. And today, we are going to be speaking about things that we've known for 20 years. And the reason why I wanted to do this series, and it's a series that you're going to be seeing hopefully a lot through season 4, is because so often in the Facebook groups and on social media, I see old pieces of information and facts, things even like the simple view of reading or Scarborough's reading rope, or evidence from the National Reading Panel's report that again was the early 2000s, and this is information that we've known for 20 or more years, and it frustrates me because I think that this is knowledge that all teachers should have by now, and it's not their fault that they're not getting this in their teacher education training programs or professional development programs, and it's not being made available to them in their professional development.
Correct.
And we're seeing that globally, really. So that's why Lynn and I do what we do. Why don't we give the listeners just a quick snippet of who you are and what you do before we get into our conversation?
Okay. Most of you know me by now. I've been a special educator. This is about my 50th year of doing this. I've been a special educator. I've been a teacher trainer. I've worked with teachers. I've worked with students. I've worked with administrators. I've been the director of intervention at the Florida Center for Reading Research, working with my mentor, Dr. Joseph Torgeson, who we'll talk about in a little while. I've been a professor at Florida State University, both campuses. And for the last 7 or 8 years, I have been focused on developing, refining, and getting the word out about both my reading intervention program, Connect to Comprehension, the extension kit, the phonics games that go along with that. We are now in 41 states and 12 other countries. And the professional development site that I've developed over the last 5 years, the Center for Literacy Learning. So that has been my focus over the last 6 or 7 years. But I come to this with a lot of different experiences, a lot of wonderful mentors along the way. So I'm happy to be with you today. And I love that Kathryn is permitting us, encouraging us to talk about this topic for exactly the reasons that she mentioned just a few minutes ago, that we've known so much of this for so long, and we just need to put it into practice.
Definitely. And I mean, you've got some great mentors here. I think when I was in school during my PhD program, they talked about your academic family tree. Yes. And having some of the big ones behind you. And, we learned so much from our mentors. And, it's a privilege to be able to talk about them with you. So where do you want to begin? I was thinking the simple view of reading.
Well, I really wanted to start with the National Reading Panel.
Sure.
If that's okay.
Of course.
That to me was the beginning of everything. And I took notes. I went back, read the summary again for probably the 1,000th time, and took some notes because these are, I think, can be our talking points.
Sure.
Okay. So the National Reading Panel came together several years before, but they published their report in 2000. So we're talking 23 years ago. So go back, think what you were doing 23 years ago. And And then as you listen to this, there will be some aha moments, because when I read it again, I got more aha moments. It's like, oh my gosh, they were saying that 23 years ago. So they identified the 5 components of reading: phonemic awareness, phonics, fluency, vocabulary, and comprehension. And they talked about how they were related. But here were the main talking points. So I'm going to read them so I don't forget.
Can I first just give listeners a little bit of a background? So this was a meta-analysis of all the research to date when it was being written. So this isn't just a one-off thing. This isn't just taking a few select studies. This is looking at all the research available at the time.
Thank you.
That's we're getting this information. It's not just a couple people sitting together in a think tank.
Thank you. That's really important to mention. And I should have said that, but thank you for following up. That's why we're doing this together, so we can help each other. Okay, so here are the points from the National Reading Panel. As Kathryn said, the meta-analysis of thousands of studies. Okay, let's start with phonemic awareness. So what they said was, point 1, phonemic awareness can be taught and learned. Okay, no surprise there. Phonemic awareness is an essential building block. No surprise there. Phonemic awareness helps students learn to read and spell. We talked in our last meeting, Kathryn, about the importance of segmenting and blending with phonemes and then with graphemes. And so that plays right into this point, that knowing about phonemic awareness, mastering phonemic awareness, helps students learn to read and spell. Now, here's something that may be an aha moment for some of you. Here's what the National Reading Panel said. Phonemic awareness is essential for all students, including older, less able readers. So the important point there is, if you have a 5th grader, a 6th grader, an 8th grader who is struggling to decode, and you tried everything, but you haven't thought about phonemic awareness, go back to what the National Reading Panel says and think to yourself, maybe this student doesn't have the ability to manipulate phonemes. Before we even talk about the letters, we need to talk about blending and segmenting sounds. So that, I think, is an important point about phonemic awareness, that it's not just for little kids.
Well, and it's essential when we're looking at our older students that are struggling, that we go back to square one and figure out where the deficits are. I know I worked in a reading assessment clinic where we worked with individuals of all ages, and I was assessing people in their 70s as well as 5-year-olds, right? And seeing people in their 70s struggle with the phonemic awareness. And I remember this one woman that I was working with, and partway through the assessment, she just broke down. And I'm like, oh, I'm sorry, I didn't mean to upset you. She's like, no, I'm not crying because you upset me. I'm crying because I understand that I just don't get it. Like, there's something wrong. It's not that I'm stupid. There's skills that I don't have.
Exactly.
And, as personally, I am severely dyslexic, and I do have a phonological processing deficit still to this day, after all of the work that I've done in linguistics and phonemic awareness. And, if it's a word that I am not familiar with and I do not know the spelling of, or even the pronunciation of, especially with some people's names, I need to figure out it on a phonemic level before I can make sure that I have the correct pronunciation.
Yes. And we need to, something you said, I think really important, that you said the woman said, I'm not stupid. We need to reassure our students over and over and over again, especially our dyslexic students. This has nothing to do with your intelligence. I know that you're really smart, but as you said, Kathryn, there are some skills that you are missing, and I know how to teach those to you. And so let's get going, but it's not because you're stupid. And I think that's how I always start out sessions with students who are struggling, by having that conversation. letting them know that I know they're smart. I know what the issues are, or I will find them out through assessment, but the issues are skill-based. They're not intellect-based. So that's an important conversation to have, especially with your older students.
Of course. And another thing that I wanted to bring up on the phonologic, or sorry, the phonemic awareness issue is one thing that I did get from my teacher education program is during the early years of development, there are so many children with ear infections and ear blockages, and that can inhibit their ability to hear the phonemes correctly. Some students do need to have tubes put in their ears, and then it's night and day. Now, I'm not saying, oh yeah, that's, that's the reason and you don't need to worry about it. What I'm saying is, if you are working with a student and they are in their speech making a lot of errors, that's something that you should be cognizant of.
Yes, absolutely. Absolutely.
Um,
So should we move on to phonics? Because we have a lot to talk about.
Yes, I know we do. But there are one thing, because we're talking, because I mentioned about mastery of phonemic awareness.
Hmm?
Now, mastery does not mean that we need to teach these students the extensive manipulation to mastery before we begin teaching reading. We're talking about the blending and segmenting of phonemes to mastery.
Yes, yes. And I think, and the National Reading Panel went into the 7 phonemic awareness skills, but they said, I don't have that in my list, but they said of those skills, segmenting and blending are the 2 most important. So we knew back then that we needed to focus on those, and we still know that.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, moving on to phonics. I want to read my list. Systematic, explicit phonics is much more effective than embedded phonics, where kids sort of figure out by word patterns, by looking at words and figuring out the rules. No, says the National Reading Panel. Start with teaching that alphabetic principle, teaching that explicitly and systematically. This is effective, they say, for all socioeconomic levels. Doesn't matter if you're a poor child, a rich child, a white child, a black child, it doesn't matter. This works for everybody. Phonics, explicit phonics, they said, is especially beneficial for those students struggling, or for those, and I should say, for those students who have been identified as high risk. So you don't have to wait until a student is struggling to provide this kind of explicit, systematic phonics instruction. As soon as you know that that student is at risk by screening, then that's the time to do this, to start. And what do they mean by explicit, systematic instruction? And I took this quote because I think this explains it. That means, this is a quote from the National Reading Panel, the direct teaching of a set of letter-sound relationships in a clearly defined sequence. Okay, direct teaching of a set of letter-sound relationships in a clearly defined sequence. Does the sequence have to be the same for everybody? I know a lot of Orton Gillingham instructors get all confused about, oh, should I be teaching this before I be teaching that? Well, the point is you teach simpler patterns before you teach more complex patterns. And if you go with that, then you're okay. Does it matter if you teach blends before you teach vowel teams? No. But simpler first. You want to start with short vowels, certainly before you do long vowel teams. So that's what they mean by that clearly defined sequence, going from simplest to more complicated patterns.
And
go ahead.
one thing that wasn't there, but I think is important to note, is making sure that the digraphs are involved. So the TH, that's not a blend. Right. That is the digraph. That is representing one phoneme. And there are digraphs that are more frequent than some of the standalone alphabetic letters. So personally, I feel it's important to make sure those diagraphs are introduced early in your scope and sequence. And I know I often get asked about, the scope and sequence. I've been involved in helping create a scope and sequence, but like you said, it's simplest to more complex, and making sure it mirrors the resources that you have. I think one thing that's often forgotten is a huge expense that is to get all the resources needed for this type of structured language and literacy instruction. And while you can create a lot on your own, it is time consuming. And if you have a set of quality decodable texts, follow the scope and sequence it has laid out instead of going with a different sequence.
Absolutely. And I'll put in a plug for Connect to Comprehension here.
Sure.
When I discovered the high noon readers and I looked at them, and I realized that the sequence, that what they had for level A or level 1 didn't make a lot of sense to me, that they had some multisyllabic words in there. It's like, why would you teach multisyllabic words before you teach single syllable words? So I took the 36 books that came in this one packet and I redivided them based on simpler to more complex, and made my own levels. And those are the levels in Connect to Comprehension. So you have 6 levels of readers with 6 sets of lessons that are exactly coordinated with the decodable text. So I won't talk any more about that, but I think it's important to mention that you have a resource available to you. And there are others, certainly, that where you don't have to reinvent the wheel. So I think that's important.
Well, and one thing that I wanted to mention while we're on the phonics topic, and this is something that I took from Debbie Hebelwhite of Phonics International, and that's, that we definitely need that explicit systematic instruction, but there still is a place for embedded incidental phonics instruction, because it's not going to take the place of your phonics lessons, but in with working throughout the day, if you're working with your students and something comes across in the material that they are reading, there is nothing wrong with just throwing that tidbit in.
Yes. Yes. Okay, so we can talk about fluency now. This is our third component of reading, and here's the National Reading Panel. Fluency is important. Why is it important? It is important because fluent reading frees students to understand what they read. So we only have so much cognitive space available. And if we use those cognitive resources in our brain to struggle with decoding, to focus on decoding, to decode word by word, we have little cognitive space left for fluency, which leads to comprehension. Fluency is the bridge to comprehension. So it's important because it frees you to understand what you are reading. Fluency, they say, results from many opportunities to practice reading and can be developed by modeling and then by having students engage in repeated oral reading. So that's one, according to the National Reading Panel, one of the best ways to develop fluency is to let students practice reading repeatedly. And the National Reading Panel also says monitoring fluency progress is important in evaluating instruction and setting goals. And when I read this again, I said, well, that's true for everything. It's not just fluency. There should be a big star there that you need to monitor progress for all of these components in order to evaluate, number one, to evaluate your instruction and to set goals. And I think it's important to know that monitoring, progress monitoring is a way to say to yourself, is my instruction effective? So it's not just about the student, it's about you as a teacher. Is what I am doing effective with this student? And if not, what can I do to change what I'm doing, to make it more explicit, to make it more systematic, to do something different so that that progress can be greater. So I think that's an important point, but progress monitoring across the board, even though the National Reading Panel only mentioned it with fluency. Okay.
Yes, well, and one thing that you highlighted, the repeated reading, and I did want to add, looking at things that we've known for 20 years, even in current today's meta-analyses and secondary meta-analyses, we are seeing that still repeated reading is that way to help build the fluency component of reading.
Yes. The other thing I think that's important to mention when we talk about progress monitoring and fluency, we don't just mean words correct per minute.
No.
It is not the only way to monitor fluency. We also, and Kathryn, you and I have talked about this how many times now, we need to, but I want to say it again because it's important. We need to also monitor prosody. We need to monitor the ability to read in meaningful phrases. We need to monitor the ability to read with appropriate emphasis, with appropriate pacing, paying attention to punctuation marks, all of those things. So it's not just a matter of reading fast. If we just track words correct per minute and say that we're monitoring fluency progress, we're doing our students a disservice.
Definitely. And recognizing that if students think and developing readers think that the point is just to read as fast as you can and get that quick score, then they're missing out on other aspects of reading that are important. And, that connection to the comprehension, that the bridge that needs to be built from the word recognition to the language comprehension, right? In order to get the reading comprehension. And the other thing with fluency, when we're looking at, the current research, it's trying to figure out, is there that golden zone of fluency? Is there that magic number that you have to be able to hit for reading fluency in order to have the level of comprehension? And there's a good range, but even if you can read a little bit, you're reading a little bit slower, you still have the ability to comprehend. Now, the other thing I wanted to mention about fluency is that just because a student is reading fluently in grade 5 does not mean that they're going to be reading fluently in grade 6, grade 7, grade 8, because the change of the demands of the text increase and will impact. So if they don't have that modeling piece and that explicit instruction in how to read fluently, it doesn't mean they're going to develop it on their own.
Yeah, that's a good point, that we need to continue to monitor. It's not just in first, second, and third grade. That's a good point, Kathryn, that we need to continue that progress monitoring. So I'm ready to move on to vocabulary because I see our time slipping away. Vocabulary quickly. Students learn the meaning. This is 23 years ago, everybody, 23 years ago. Students learn the meaning of most words indirectly through conversations, through reading, if they can read. But there are vocabulary words that need to be taught directly, says the National Reading Panel. Now, remember that because we're going to talk about Isabel Beck in just a couple minutes. That teachers need to teach students individual words and word learning strategies. And so using the context, yes. Morphology, yes. All of those things that play into vocabulary. Why do we teach vocabulary? Because it directly influences reading comprehension. Think about if you were reading and you didn't understand every 5th word or every 3rd word or even every 10th word, how would your comprehension be? It wouldn't be good at all. We talked on Wednesday about the importance of interactive read aloud. So we're building vocabulary at a level that's maybe higher than what students can actually read. We're teaching those words.
And at this point, sorry, I just want to interrupt.
Sure.
Something to highlight here is that when we talk about struggling readers and the Matthew effect, where the rich get richer and the poor get poorer, that's definitely the case for vocabulary.
Absolutely.
Because if students are not able to read at their comprehension level, they're not going to have the exposure to the vocabulary words. So it's very important that we make sure that these students are able to hear or ear read texts at their comprehension level and a little bit above to build their vocabulary while they're still working on their word recognition skills.
So there's the Scarborough reading wrote the language part of that. We need to continue to build the language in. Okay, here is the really important part. Here's the part that's like, oh yes, okay, this is National Reading Panel. Effective vocabulary instruction focuses on teaching important words, useful words, and difficult words. Not all words can be taught, so it's important to choose. And that will lead us directly into 2002 and Isabel Beck. But we'll talk about Isabel Beck in just a minute after we finish with vocabulary and talk a little bit about comprehension. But remember, we're going to get back to Isabel Beck.
Of course.
Should we move on to comprehension, Kathryn?
Yes,
definitely. All right. So comprehension skills, this is the National Reading Panel 2000, can be improved by teaching specific cognitive strategies. So even back in 2000, the National Reading Panel is refuting the argument that I still hear today, and it makes my blood boil. Oh, once a student can decode, he automatically understands what he is reading. And I have even heard this from reading coaches, I promise you. And so let's go back to the National Reading Panel. Comprehension skills can be improved by teaching specific cognitive strategies. Amen to that, right?
And teaching explicitly.
Explicitly, yes. They are best learned when the teacher models and demonstrates each strategy until students can carry them out independently. And I'll add, as you are teaching these strategies, you will teach them one by one, but the goal is to have students be able to use all the comprehension strategies flexibly so that they can use the right strategy to match the text, to match the part of the text, to match the purpose of reading. So that flexibility is important.
And this is where something that you mentioned last time, Louisa Moats, every teacher is a reading teacher. So just because you teach social studies or mathematics or the sciences or another humanities doesn't mean you're not teaching the students about reading and how to comprehension the text in that topic.
Yes.
Right? Reading a science textbook is very, very different than reading your Of Mice and Men.
Exactly.
And, you know, I've worked with students for years and years now as a tutor. And, you know, seeing textbooks that are well laid out with all these comprehension strategies laid out at the beginning, but they don't even look at them like, okay, well, you know, it's not there just to add pages to the book.
Yes, right.
And I have yet to meet a student that has had a teacher saying, okay, the homework is to do this. Use these strategies that the book has laid out. I'm going to talk you through them, how to do them, and to explain why we're doing this. You know, you can't just leave that up to chance, because there are students that reading is hard and they're going to see these pages at the beginning of the text or the chapter that don't really seem important.
And it's just more to read, and reading is
exactly
difficult.
Exactly. But then they miss it and don't get that. So we need to make sure that there is that explicit instruction within the classroom across disciplines.
Well, you just said what the National Reading Panel just said. You could have been the National Reading Panel, Kathryn. Effective comprehension instruction is explicit and direct and includes explanations, modeling, guided practice, and application. So what you just said. And here's another wow. Back in 2000, comprehension instruction should begin at the beginning rather than waiting until students have mastered the basics of reading. So the National Reading Panel is saying what we've been saying: interactive read alouds, books, list audio books, all of those things that are at the student's language level, not necessarily at their decoding level. Okay, so that's
It's
all I'm going to say
important
about the reading panel.
It's important to say that about the National Reading Panel, because that's where, again, we're talking about the science of reading structure literally really started to build from.
Yes.
And then we have these reading wars for the, the whole language and the balanced literacy, saying that they're saying that comprehension isn't important. But in the document,
or that it's automatic, I think.
Exactly.
Yeah.
But they're saying that the structured literacy misses out on that. But it doesn't if it's done the way that it's best laid out. And we should mention that, we have had document after document complete similar meta-analyses over a different range span in time, and having consistent findings with the National Reading Panel, and highlighting more the importance of morphology.
Yes, yes. I just read something lately about that was an analysis of what older students need, and the 2 points they made was older students need a structured strategy for taking apart multisyllabic words, and they need increased focus on morphology. So you and I have been talking about that, and a lot of the current research is pointing that out over and over and over again. Those are the 2 biggies. Mm-hmm. So I want to talk just a few minutes about Isabel Beck, just a very few minutes. So Isabel Beck and her colleagues, there were others, she took the information from the National Reading Panel. Remember, we talked about how you can't teach all words, so you have to choose carefully. They have to be useful. They have to be important words. They have to be everyday words, but they have to be words with depth. And she wrote, to me, a world-changing book called Bringing Words to Life. And that was right after the National Reading Panel. That was 2 years later, based on research. Wonderful reading researcher. And this is a book that every teacher, not just of reading, every teacher should read, because it teaches you how to choose the words to teach and then how to teach them. And not just to teach them using definitions, and not even just to teach them using student-friendly definitions that students understand, but how to help students interact with the words that they are learning and internalize the words that they are learning, and have them not just be receptive vocabulary, but expressive vocabulary. So words not just that they understand, but words that they can use in conversation. It's a wonderful book, and I have it on, I have about 10 books on my desk here, and that is one of them. And I refer to it a lot still after, well, I have the second edition now, but the first edition published in 2002. So we've known for a long time about how to teach vocabulary. So Kathryn, every teacher should be a teacher of reading. Every teacher should be a teacher of vocabulary, right? Yes.
Well, every teacher is a teacher of language on the many levels that we use it to communicate, whether it's written or spoken.
Yes, absolutely. I want to talk for just a minute about Lynn Airy, yes, who was one of the important people that I learned about from Dr. Torgeson when I was at the Florida Center for Reading Research. In fact, she was the first researcher that he introduced me to, not personally, but introduced me to through her work. And she talked about the 4 phases of reading. We don't have time to go through those, but the point is that children go through 4 phases of reading, and the time that it takes them to get through those phases will, of course, vary depending on whether or not they have learning issues, language issues, whether or not they're dyslexic. But she pointed out that students first learn to read at the pre-alphabetic phase, where they're using cues, like they're learning that the M thing stands for McDonald's. Anyway, so she was important in furthering our knowledge of reading. And this was even before, this was in 2005. So building on what the National Reading Panel had to say. And the other thing that Lynn Airy helped us with And people now are just starting to talk about this. But this was in 2000, this was actually before 2005, the idea of orthographic mapping. Did we think that was something new? If you did, because a lot of people are talking about it as if it's something brand new that we are just discovering. But no, Lynn Airy first talked about it in 2003. And this is,
Okay, that's 20 years now, right?
that's 20 years. So, and that's how we make connections to words to bond them in our memory. That's the best way I can explain it. Kathryn, can you think of a better way to explain orthographic mapping? It's not a technique, it's what our brain does.
Yeah, and I've actually devised my own theory. I call it the simple view of orthographic mapping.
Oh, cool.
And it's a formula where we bind the pronunciation with the print form and the meaning. And sorry, I called it PMS because it was pronunciation, meaning, and spelling need to be combined together in order to achieve the orthographic mapping. And I really like, I know I read about it in Dr. Stanislaus Dehaene's book, The Assembly of Demons analogy for orthographic mapping, because to me, it just, when I read that, I'm like, oh, that's how I'm going to explain it. So when I talk about orthographic and mapping and I teach about it, I use a simple view of orthographic mapping, and I'm going to try and get a blog post about that soon. And I talk about the assembly of gremlins because I couldn't find a good demon that I like. So I have the gremlins from the movie, different ones. And yeah.
Gremlins are better anyway than demons.
Exactly. Yeah. So we as teachers need to make sure we are doing everything in our power to help students orthographically map words and using teaching strategies that support that follow the recommendations from the National Reading Panel.
You mentioned something that made me think about another contribution that Lynn Airy made. For many years, we talked about sight words.
Yes.
And what we were talking about at that point before Lynn Airy was high frequency words. Those two were synonymous in our educational vocabulary. But Lynn Airy wrote a series of papers where she talked about every word is a sight word. Once you have orthographically mapped it, every word is a sight word. So when we talk about high frequency words, we're talking about the Dolch list, the Fry list, but they're not sight words, or they can be sight words once they've been orthographically mapped.
And stored in your visual word form area. That's the part of the brain that isn't there naturally. This is the part of the brain that we need to create through reading instruction. So we can orthographically map words to become sight words so that we can look at it and read it unconsciously or almost unconsciously, right? You cannot help read a word that you see on the page, and it will take you more time to sound it out and decode it using decoding strategies because your brain just knows what it does, and it does it as an impulse.
Yes, yes. So we can thank Lynn Airy for all of those important things about reading starting in 2003. So we're still talking 20 years or maybe a little bit less than that. I wanted to talk just for a few minutes, so we don't have much more, about the brain studies, because while the National Reading Panel was going forward, at the same time, starting at the same time, and then continuing way beyond that and continuing today, have been studies of the brain, how we learn to read. And you mentioned Dr. Dehaene, wonderful book called Reading in the Brain that everybody should read. It's hard to get through, but don't you think it's hard for me to get through?
It's not the first book you should read on this topic.
Right.
Just like Dr. Mark Seidenberg's book, Language at the Speed of, no, what's this called?
Language at the Speed of Sound.
Yeah, it is Language at the Speed of Sound, right? Yes. I had to look at my bookshelf. Those aren't the first books to do a nosedive into. You want to have a little bit of background knowledge and understanding of concepts. Otherwise, you will find it very overwhelming I can almost guarantee, unless you have a neuroscience background.
And you can take it in little bites rather than trying to eat the whole book. Take little bites, mull them over, and then come back. That's what I had to do when I first read Reading in the Brain, because I was overwhelmed even after being a teacher for a long time.
And they do have great videos on YouTube that you can watch them explaining some of the concepts that you can go to. Okay, I think I understand, but let me just double check.
So that's what's happening now. It's continuing. But my mentor, Dr. Tillman at the Skank School, told me about a fascinating man. And I remember being fascinated. We're going all the way back to the 1990s. And Dr. Galaberta. And what did Dr. Galaberta do? Well, he was very interested in dyslexia and how maybe the brain was different in dyslexic children and adults. So what did he do? He did autopsies on adults and even on children who had died tragically on their brains. And he took a look at their brains and the brains of normal people doing autopsies, and discovered that, yes, there were actually neuroanatomical differences in the brain. 1990. So, so it's been a long time that we've known that children and adults don't choose to be dyslexic. They don't choose to have learning disabilities. It's not because they don't want to read or want to learn, but these are neuroanatomical differences that were identified as early as the 1990s. Well, actually before that, but Dr. Orton actually kind of started us on that process. But Dr. Galaberta actually has pictures that you can look at. So here's a picture of a dyslexic brain. Here's a picture of a non-dyslexic brain. And so that work has continued to this day, and has resulted in Dr. DeHane and Dr. Seidenberg and other people examining that even more closely. So I think that's important to know.
What's fascinating is we now have the technology. I mean, it's not 20 years ago yet, but where we can actually look at a brain using fMRI imaging as it's learning to read and as it is reading. So we can see what is actually happening, or what area, no, we can't see what's happening. We can see what areas are lighting up, where that blood flow is occurring in the brain during the process of reading. And that we are taking to infer what areas of the brain are being used in the process. And that has incredibly enhanced our understanding and our support for best practices in teaching reading.
So then the question becomes, can we actually change the way the brain functions? And I want to mention one study that was done in 2004. It's like my favorite study, by Benita Blackman, Sally Shaywitz, and Chris Schatzsnyder, who I worked with at FCR, a wonderful researcher and statistician. And what this did was it took a group of 2nd and 3rd grade students who had been identified as dyslexic, and they have brain pictures of them, and they provided explicit instruction for 50 minutes a day. This was one-on-one instruction, and if you go and read the research, they will tell you exactly what they did in this explicit instruction. And it's what we know to do today. It's, starting with phonemic awareness, going through phonics, working on fluency, all of those things they did, working on encoding. And what they found after, I don't remember how long they did it, but what they showed was that the brain changed in these students because of their instruction. So it's like, do you want to change the brain? Yes. Can you do it? Yes. And the really cool thing about this was that these students had made gains. They were on grade level at the end of this intervention. And they went back and tested them a year later to see if they had maintained gains and they had stayed on grade level. And yes, they have. So that was wonderful. That was in 2004. And Kathryn, we could maybe put the link to that study.
Yes, what I'm hoping to do is getting a reference list of all the wonderful things that you've brought up, and we'll put it in the show notes for people
That
to,
would be great. That would be great. So now, we're talking about the science of reading, and we see that everywhere. So all of the
that's right
textbook,
now.
all of the textbook companies are saying, oh yes, we're science of reading based. Every program says, oh, it's science of reading based. But what does that really mean? Well, it means taking all of the information that Kathryn and I have been talking about, those 20 years worth of research, compiling them and using them. So just buyer beware, be careful. Be careful that just because somebody says, oh, this is the science of reading, is it really? It reminds me of the time when I was at FCRR, and the buzzwords then were research based. Okay, those were the buzzwords. So every reading company slapped that label on the front of their manuals, research based. Did they change anything? No, for the most part, they didn't. They slapped that label on, and we talked to people at that time and said, be careful. Just because something says it's research based doesn't mean it is. Same thing applies today. That hasn't changed in 20 years. Publishing companies are still slapping labels onto things and asking you to believe it. And in some cases, it's, I want to say, false advertising.
Well, and it's the same thing with university programs and other programs that have historically been balanced literacy or whole language based. I can think of a couple of common edgy celebrities that, I'm like, oh, well, I've read a book or two, and so now I am in line. But no, this is not a process that happens overnight. There is actually tons of learning. And the thing is, we're still learning. It's not a fully defined science. So what we know today, in 5 years, we will still know how to do better than we can, even with the best knowledge we have today. There is room for improvement. And as we continue to conduct research and analyze it, we'll say, oh, you know what? We need to tweak it here to make it that much better, so we can save the children and the individuals that much more. And it's not that we think that any teacher wants to do something wrong. And that's one thing we haven't discussed, is the guilt that occurs when you recognize that what you've done in the past isn't in line with what you know now and what you should be doing. And that is something to process. But we're doing it with the child or the student's best reader or best intentions at heart.
Yes.
So whether you are just starting out now or you've been doing it for a couple of years, there is still more. I am still constantly reading articles, reading books. I have a friend that does a lot of meta-analyses, and we're always talking about his most recent one. He's better at doing the meta-analyses than I am. So I leave that to him, and then I read what he says and say what we think. And so it's a continual process, and it is for the reader's best interests that we're trying to do this, not to make, ourselves famous or make huge amounts of money. We want to be compensated for the work that we do put in to do it, and recognize that it's a learning process. And the other thing that we've known for years, decades, is that it is not too late to teach someone how to read. There are people in their 70s, in their 80s who are just learning how to read. It can be done. It should be done. And just because the student's in grade 6 or grade 7 doesn't mean you should just give up hope. Because if that were the case, I would not be reading.
And when you read the statement that, well, it takes 4 times as long to teach a 4th grader who's struggling than a 1st grader, well, that may very well be true. But that doesn't mean, as Kathryn said, that doesn't mean we should just throw up our hands and say, oh, no, he's too old.
And that doesn't mean that you just throw accommodations and assistive technology and say, okay, well, We fixed the problem because too often I see schools doing that. Oh, well, they have an iPad and they can just ear read, which, is a very appropriate accommodation, but that does not mean that you should stop the reading intervention and instruction. And you can simultaneously, and that's why I originally thought that we could maybe start with Scarborough's reading rope, is recognizing and reading, or sorry, not the simple view of reading, which has been around since the 80s. Was it 86? I think
you're right.
Yeah. But the mid to late 80s is this idea that reading comprehension is composed of word recognition and language comprehension. Now that is essential because it helps us recognize that there are two components we need to be considering when we're looking with a struggling reader, and recognizing that both these factors, the word recognition and the language comprehension, have an equal amount of stake in the final result. And you can be working on the word recognition side of things while still providing the student with ways to not have to worry about it when they're reading age-appropriate, grade-appropriate text for content, knowledge, and learning with their peers in the classroom.
Yes, well said. We probably should have started out with that, but I was nervous about getting through the national. I really wanted to highlight the National Reading Panel because I think that serves as I saw a really good image with these 5 pillars, actual columns and a Greek or Greek, and I think to me that is a good visual for what the National Reading Panel did for us. It provided the foundation for our building, what keeps our building standing, our building of reading with these students. So I'm glad we had time to circle back and talk about the simple view of reading. If anyone has anything they want to say to Kathryn or to me, you can certainly email us, call us, get in touch with us, and we can continue this discussion, right, Kathryn?
Of course.
Yes.
Always.
And I have really enjoyed being with you this week. It's been a lot of fun, and I hope we'll be able to do it again sometime.
Yes, of course. Take care, everyone.
Bye.